when billionaire Alexander Kane sprinted away from his own $5 million wedding, leaving 300 shocked guests and a devastated bride behind, he thought his life was over. What he didn't know was that his quiet housekeeper Elena would be waiting in the shadows, ready to pick up the pieces of his shattered world and show him what real love actually means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton glittered like a scene from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across tables draped in ivory silk, and thousands of white roses filled the air with their intoxicating perfume. A 30-piece orchestra played soft classical melodies that echoed through the opulent space. Every detail had been orchestrated to perfection, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the champagne fountain that sparkled like liquid gold. Alexander Kane stood at the altar, his hands trembling inside his custom Italian gloves. At 38, he was finally marrying Vivian Ashford, the socialite daughter of a prominent political family. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a merger of two dynasties, a business transaction wrapped in white satin and promises. His technology empire had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country, but today felt like the ultimate validation. Success, status, and the perfect wife to complete his carefully constructed image. "You ready for this, Alex?" whispered his best man Marcus, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. "Been ready for years," Alexander replied, though his stomach churned with an emotion he couldn't quite name. 400 guests filled the ballroom. Politicians, celebrities, business moguls, and European royalty had flown in for what the media called the wedding of the decade. This was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the final piece of his perfect life. The orchestra's tempo shifted, signaling the bride's grand entrance. Alexander straightened his shoulders and forced his most confident smile. The massive doors at the back of the ballroom opened with theatrical precision, but instead of relief or joy, a wave of panic crashed over him like ice water. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. He was about to marry a woman he barely knew, in front of people who saw him as a business opportunity rather than a human being. His entire life had become a performance, and this wedding was just another scene in a play he never wanted to star in. As Vivian appeared in the doorway, radiant in her $20,000 gown, Alexander felt something inside him snap. The walls of the ballroom seemed to close in. The faces of the guests blurred into a sea of expectation and judgment. His breathing became shallow, his vision tunneled, and one thought screamed louder than the orchestra, louder than his racing heart. "Run." Without a word, without explanation, Alexander Kane turned away from the altar and walked straight toward the side exit. His groomsmen called after him in confusion. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Camera flashes exploded as reporters realized they were witnessing the scandal of the year. "Alexander, where are you going?" Marcus shouted, but Alexander didn't stop, didn't look back. He pushed through the emergency exit and found himself in the hotel's service corridor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The muffled chaos from the ballroom followed him, but he kept walking, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor with urgent rhythm. Behind him, pandemonium erupted. Vivian's shriek of humiliation echoed through the ballroom. Guests erupted in shocked whispers and frantic phone calls. Wedding planners scrambled to manage the disaster while photographers captured every moment of the spectacular collapse. Alexander didn't care about any of it. For the first time in years, maybe in his entire adult life, he was doing something that felt real. Terrifying, destructive, but absolutely real. He burst through another door and found himself in the hotel's loading dock, gasping the cool evening air like a man who'd been underwater too long. His bow tie felt like a noose. He tore it off and threw it into a dumpster, followed by his jacket. The designer tuxedo that had cost more than most people's cars now felt like a costume he was desperate to shed. A taxi was idling near the loading dock, its driver smoking a cigarette while waiting for his next fare. Alexander ran toward it, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement. "Hey, you okay, buddy?" the driver asked, flicking away his cigarette as Alexander yanked open the passenger door. "Drive," Alexander gasped, collapsing into the back seat. "Just drive. Please." "Where to?" Alexander realized he had no idea. His penthouse felt contaminated by the life he was fleeing. His office was the last place he wanted to be. Every restaurant, every club, every corner of his social world would be buzzing with news of his spectacular public breakdown within the hour. "Home," he said finally, giving the driver the address of his estate in the hills. It was the only place he could think of that might offer sanctuary. The 40-minute drive passed in a blur of city lights and racing thoughts. Alexander's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he turned it off and stared out the window at a world that suddenly felt foreign. What had he done? He'd humiliated Vivian, destroyed months of planning, and probably cost his family's reputation everything. The business implications alone would be catastrophic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But underneath the panic, something else flickered. Relief. Pure, unexpected relief. When the taxi pulled up to his estate's iron gates, Alexander realized he didn't have his wallet. His personal effects were back at the hotel, abandoned with his coat. "Listen, I don't have my wallet with me, but if you give me your card, I'll pay you triple the fare plus tip," he told the driver. The elderly man studied Alexander's face in the rearview mirror, taking in the disheveled hair, the missing bow tie, the wild look in his eyes. "You know what, son? This one's on me. You look like you've had enough trouble for one night." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes at the stranger's unexpected kindness. When was the last time someone had shown him simple human compassion without wanting something in return? "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. The taxi disappeared into the night, leaving Alexander alone at his own front gate. He pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner, and the gates swung open with their familiar mechanical hum. The long driveway curved through perfectly manicured gardens toward the modern glass mansion that had been featured on the cover of Architectural Digest. As he approached the house, Alexander noticed warm light glowing from the kitchen windows. Someone was inside. His first thought was panic. Had the media already tracked him down? Were reporters waiting to ambush him with questions about his dramatic exit? But then he remembered. Elena. Elena Reyes had been his housekeeper for 3 years. Though that title hardly captured the scope of what she did. She managed his household with quiet efficiency, anticipated his needs before he voiced them, and somehow made his vast, cold mansion feel like something approaching a home. She was supposed to have the evening off for the wedding, but she'd mentioned something about preparing the house for his return from the honeymoon. Alexander hesitated at his own front door. He'd barely spoken to Elena beyond basic instructions and polite pleasantries. She was part of the background of his life, reliable and invisible. Now she would witness his complete breakdown, his transformation from successful businessman to runaway groom in designer clothes. He unlocked the door and stepped into the marble foyer, immediately smelling something wonderful coming from the kitchen. Coffee and something else. Baking bread, maybe. The familiar scents wrapped around him like a warm blanket, a sharp contrast to the sterile perfume of the hotel ballroom. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was in her early 30s, with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore her usual uniform of dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, but something was different about her expression. Instead of the professional smile she usually wore, her face showed genuine surprise and concern. "Mr. Kane?" she said, her slight accent adding musical notes to his name. "You're back early. Is everything all right?" Alexander opened his mouth to give her some polished explanation, some version of events that would preserve his dignity. Instead, what came out was the truth. "I ran away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I ran away from my own wedding." Elena's eyes widened, but she didn't gasp or exclaim or ask a dozen questions like everyone else would. She simply stepped closer, her dark eyes full of compassion. "Are you hurt?" she asked. The question caught him completely off guard. Not, "Why did you run?" Or, "What about Vivian?" Or, "Do you know what this will do to your reputation?" Just concern for his well-being, as if he were a person rather than a public figure whose dramatic choices would dominate tomorrow's headlines. "I don't know," Alexander said honestly. He felt like he'd been turned inside out, every emotion raw and exposed. "I think I might be." Elena nodded as if this made perfect sense. Come sit down. I'll make you some tea. She led him into the kitchen, which glowed with warm light from pendant lamps over the marble island. The space was spotless as always, but it felt lived in tonight in a way it usually didn't. A loaf of bread cooling on a rack filled the air with its yeasty sweetness, and a pot of soup simmered on the stove. You've been cooking, Alexander observed, sliding onto one of the bar stools. I wanted the house to feel welcoming when you returned from your trip, Elena explained, setting a kettle on to boil. I thought you might be tired from traveling. Alexander almost laughed at the irony. She'd been preparing a homecoming while he was destroying his entire life 20 miles away. Were you watching the news? He asked. Elena shook her head. I don't watch much television. Too depressing. She pulled 2 mugs from a cabinet and selected a box of chamomile tea. Would you like to tell me what happened? The simple question opened floodgates Alexander didn't know existed. As Elena prepared the tea with calm, methodical movements, he found himself talking. He told her about the panic that had overwhelmed him at the altar, about the realization that his entire life was built on other people's expectations rather than his own desires. He talked about the pressure to be perfect, to live up to an image that felt like a prison. Elena listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. She didn't try to fix anything or offer advice. She just listened, which was something Alexander realized he'd been hungry for without knowing it. I've destroyed everything, he concluded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug she'd placed in front of him. My reputation, Vivian's trust, probably several business deals. The media will have a field day. Elena was quiet for a moment, stirring honey into her own tea. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Alexander nodded. Before tonight, were you happy? The question was so simple, so direct, that it took his breath away. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his happiness? When was the last time he'd even considered it as a factor in his decisions? I thought I was, he said slowly. I thought success and happiness were the same thing. And now? Alexander stared into his tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. Now I don't know what happiness looks like. I'm not sure I ever did. Elena reached across the counter and briefly touched his hand. The contact was gentle, reassuring, completely without agenda. Then maybe tonight wasn't about destroying everything, she said softly. Maybe it was about finding a chance to build something real. Her words hit him with unexpected force. This woman, who he'd barely noticed despite seeing her nearly every day, had just articulated something he couldn't put into words himself. Why are you being so kind to me? He asked. Most people would think I'm crazy, or selfish, or worse. Elena smiled, and it transformed her entire face. My grandmother used to say that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who never really saw you anyway. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping their tea while the storm of Alexander's choices raged in the world beyond his kitchen. For the first time in years, maybe in his entire adult life, he felt present in his own skin. Not performing, not calculating his next move, just existing as himself. I don't know what happens next, he admitted. That's okay, Elena said. Tomorrow is tomorrow. Tonight you're safe, you're home, and you made a choice that felt true to you. That's enough for now. Outside, Alexander's phone began buzzing again on the counter where he'd left it. The world was undoubtedly looking for him, demanding explanations and consequences. But in the warm glow of his kitchen, with his quiet, wise woman who saw him as a person rather than a public figure, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. As the night deepened around them, Elena quietly prepared a simple meal, while Alexander slowly emerged from the shock of his dramatic decision. She moved around the kitchen with graceful efficiency, her presence both unobtrusive and somehow essential. When had his house ever felt this much like a home? Mr. Kane, Elena said, setting a bowl of soup in front of him. Alexander, he corrected gently. After tonight, I think we can use first names. Elena smiled. Alexander, you should eat something. It's been a long day. As he tasted the soup, rich with vegetables and herbs, Alexander realized he was hungry. Not just for food, but for this, for genuine human connection, for moments that mattered more than meetings or mergers. "This is delicious," he said, and meant it. "It's my grandmother's recipe," Elena replied. "She always said good food could heal almost anything." "Was she right?" Elena's eyes sparkled with gentle humor. "We'll find out." The next morning, Alexander woke on his own living room couch, with a cashmere throw blanket draped over him. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality crashed back. The wedding. The running. The complete upheaval of his carefully constructed life. He sat up, his body stiff from sleeping on furniture not designed for overnight use. The house was quiet, but he could smell coffee brewing somewhere in the distance. His phone lay on the coffee table, still turned off. He wasn't ready to face the digital storm waiting inside that small black rectangle. Elena appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee, fresh fruit, and what looked like homemade pastries. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater instead of her usual uniform, making her look younger, more relaxed. "Good morning," she said simply, setting the tray on the coffee table. "I wasn't sure if you'd want breakfast, but I thought you might be hungry." Alexander ran his hands through his hair, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look. His wedding shirt was wrinkled, his pants creased from sleeping in them. "Elena, I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to take care of me like this. It's your weekend." She sat in the armchair across from him, cradling her own coffee mug. "I chose to stay. After what you told me last night, I didn't think you should be alone." Her kindness was almost overwhelming. Alexander couldn't remember the last time someone had made a choice based purely on concern for his well-being. "Have you turned on the news?" he asked, dreading the answer. Elena shook her head. "No, but your security system logged 43 visitors at the front gate since midnight. I assume they're reporters." Alexander groaned, dropping his face into his hands. "This is going to be a nightmare." "For whom?" He looked up at her, confused by the question. "The reporters want a story," Elena continued. "Your former fiancé wants an explanation. The business world wants to know what this means for your company. But what do you want, Alexander?" It was such a simple question, yet he realized he'd spent most of his adult life avoiding it entirely. What did he want? Beyond the expectations, beyond the pressure, beyond the image he'd been maintaining for so long he'd forgotten it was just a facade. "I want to understand what happened to me last night," he said slowly. "I want to figure out who I really am underneath all this success and status." Elena nodded as if this was the most reasonable goal in the world. "Then maybe we should start there." Over the next few hours, Elena helped Alexander begin the process of damage control. Not the kind his publicist would recommend, but the kind that might actually lead to healing. She fielded calls from his assistant, his lawyer, and his head of security, while Alexander took a shower and changed into comfortable clothes. When he emerged from his bedroom wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, Elena was in his home office, having organized the most urgent messages into neat piles. "Vivian called 6 times, she reported. "Your mother called twice. The mayor's office called once, probably about the charity gala next month. And there are 47 emails from reporters requesting interviews." Alexander stared at the organized chaos of his life. "What did you tell them?" "That you're taking time to process recent events and will respond when you're ready. Nothing more." The boundary she'd created felt like a gift. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without immediately having to explain or apologize or manage everyone else's reactions to his choices. "I need to call Vivian," he said, though the thought made his stomach clench. "Do you want privacy for that?" Alexander considered this. The old him would have said yes, would have handled this crisis behind closed doors with carefully chosen words designed to minimize damage. But Elena's presence had become oddly comforting, a reminder that not every interaction had to be a performance. "No," he said. "If you don't mind staying, I'd appreciate the moral support." Elena settled into the chair across from his desk as Alexander picked up his phone with shaking hands. Vivian answered on the first ring. "Alexander Kane, you coward!" Her voice was ice-cold fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" Vivian, I'm sorry. I know there's nothing I can say to... Sorry, you humiliated me in front of 400 people. My father's political career is in ruins. The wedding cost my family $2 million. And you think sorry covers it? Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every accusation. She was right to be furious. His dramatic exit had consequences that rippled far beyond his own life. You're absolutely right to be angry, he said. I handled this in the worst possible way. But Vivian, if I'd gone through with the wedding, it would have been even more unfair to you. What are you talking about? Alexander glanced at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. I realized at the altar that I was marrying you for all the wrong reasons. Because it looked right. Because our families expected it. Because it fit the image of success I thought I needed. That's not fair to either of us. Silence stretched across the phone line. When Vivian spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less hurt. So you decided this at the altar? Not during our year-long engagement? Not during any of our conversations about our future? The question cut deep, because it was fair. Alexander had been sleepwalking through their relationship, going through the motions because it was what was expected. I was lying to myself about what I wanted, he admitted. I convinced myself that what made sense on paper would eventually become real feelings. That was wrong, and it wasn't fair to you. I loved you, Vivian said, her voice breaking slightly. I know. And you deserved someone who loved you back the same way. I'm sorry I wasn't that person. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, painful but necessary. By the end, Vivian was still angry, but some of the raw hurt had been replaced by a grudging understanding. She hung up with a curt goodbye and a promise that her lawyers would be in touch about the financial arrangements. Alexander set down the phone and slumped in his chair. That was horrible but necessary. How do you feel? Elena asked. Awful. But also relieved. Is that terrible? It's honest, Elena replied. Sometimes doing the right thing feels terrible at first. Over the following days, Elena became Alexander's anchor in the chaos that followed his dramatic wedding exit. She managed the household while he dealt with the legal and financial fallout. She screened calls and visitors while he met with lawyers and accountants. Most importantly, she created a sense of normalcy in a life that had been turned completely upside down. The media attention was intense but mercifully brief. Alexander's publicist managed to spin the story as a mutual decision rather than a dramatic abandonment, and within a week, the gossip cycle had moved on to other scandals. But the real work was just beginning. One evening, as Elena prepared dinner in the kitchen, Alexander found himself watching her move around the space with easy confidence. She'd been staying in one of the guest rooms, claiming it was temporary while things settled down. But her presence had transformed the house in ways that went beyond practical help. Can I ask you something? He said, sitting at the kitchen island where they'd shared so many conversations over the past week. Of course. Why are you doing this? Going so far beyond what anyone could expect from an employee? Elena paused in her chopping of vegetables for the salad. Because I've watched you for 3 years, Alexander. I've seen you work 16-hour days, take calls at midnight, skip meals because you were too busy to eat. I've seen you be generous with charities and kind to delivery people and patient with demanding clients. But I've never seen you do anything just for yourself. She set down her knife and turned to face him fully. When you ran from that wedding, it was the first time I'd seen you make a choice based on what you actually wanted instead of what you thought you should want. That took courage. It felt like cowardice. Cowardice would have been going through with a marriage you knew was wrong just to avoid disappointing people. Alexander absorbed this perspective, so different from the narrative playing in his own head. What made you so wise? Elena smiled. My grandmother. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She'd survived poverty in Mexico, immigrated to America with nothing, worked 3 jobs to put herself through night school to become a nurse. She taught me that the hardest battles are the ones you fight with yourself. Is she still alive? She died 2 years ago, but her voice is still in my head, especially when I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do. Alexander felt a pang of loss for a woman he'd never met, but who had clearly shaped the person sitting across from him. She sounds amazing. She would have liked you, Elena said. Not the public version, but the real you. The one who builds furniture in his garage. Alexander blinked in surprise. You know about that? I've seen the sawdust on your clothes sometimes when you come in from the garage. And I've noticed the bookshelf you built for the library and the coffee table in your study. They're beautiful. He'd never mentioned his woodworking hobby to anyone. It felt too personal, too removed from his business image. Yet Elena had observed and appreciated this hidden part of himself without him ever sharing it. I started woodworking in college, he admitted. It was the only time my mind felt quiet, but when I started the company, there was no time for hobbies that didn't serve the business. When was the last time you built something? Alexander thought about it. Maybe 6 months ago? I started a dining room table but never finished it. Elena's eyes lit up. Could I see it? No one had ever expressed interest in his woodworking before. Vivian had found it puzzling, a waste of time that could be better spent on networking or deal-making. But Elena's curiosity felt genuine, personal. He led her to the 3-car garage which he'd converted into a workshop years ago. The space was organized, but dusty from disuse. Half-finished projects sat on workbenches, and the air carried the faint scent of wood shavings and varnish. The dining room table sat in the center of the space, its rich walnut surface partially sanded, its legs waiting for final assembly. Alexander, this is incredible, Elena breathed, running her hand along the smooth wood. The grain is beautiful. Why didn't you finish it? I got busy with a merger. Then there was another deal, then another. I kept meaning to come back to it, but there was always something more important. Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What if we finished it together? You want to help me build furniture? I want to help you remember who you are when you're not being a businessman. Something shifted in Alexander's chest at her words. Here was someone who not only accepted the parts of himself he'd hidden away, but actively wanted to encourage them. I don't know if I remember how, he admitted. Then we'll figure it out together. They spent the next several evenings in the garage workshop. Elena proved to be a quick learner and an eager helper, holding pieces steady while Alexander worked, asking thoughtful questions about technique and design. The work was meditative, requiring focus and patience rather than the quick decision-making that dominated his business life. As they worked, they talked. Elena shared stories about her childhood, her grandmother's wisdom, her dreams of eventually opening her own restaurant. Alexander found himself opening up about his early struggles building his company, his relationship with his deceased father, his fears about whether he'd built his success on a foundation of authenticity or just clever marketing. Your father would be proud of you, Elena said one evening as they applied the final coat of finish to the table. Would he? I'm not sure. He was a high school principal who believed in service over profit. He wanted me to be a teacher. And instead, you built a company that employs thousands of people and donates millions to education. You found a different way to serve. Alexander had never thought about his business in those terms. He'd been so focused on metrics and market share that he'd lost sight of the human impact of his work. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, he said. About whether what I've built actually matters. Elena stopped polishing the wood and looked at him directly. What would matter to you? If you could rebuild your life from scratch, what would it look like? The question hung between them in the quiet garage, illuminated by the warm work lights they'd strung up. Alexander realized that for the first time in years, maybe ever, he was in a space where he could consider that question honestly. I think I'd want to build things that last, he said slowly. Not just profitable quarters or stock prices, but things that make people's lives genuinely better. Communities, opportunities, maybe physical things like this table that families can gather around for decades. Elena smiled. That doesn't sound like rebuilding. That sounds like remembering. As the weeks passed, Alexander began to see his life through Elena's eyes. She noticed things he'd overlooked, appreciated aspects of himself he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Under her gentle influence, he started making small changes. He began having real conversations with his employees, instead of just reviewing performance metrics. He visited the community centers his foundation funded, instead of just writing checks. He spent mornings in his workshop before heading to the office. The changes were subtle but profound. His assistant noticed he seemed more relaxed. His business partners commented that his decision-making had become more thoughtful, less reactive. Most importantly, Alexander began to recognize himself again. But the most significant change was how he felt about Elena herself. What had started as gratitude for her kindness during his crisis had gradually deepened into something far more complex. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations more than his morning business calls. He noticed the way she hummed while cooking, the careful way she tended the plants throughout his house, the genuine joy in her eyes when she laughed at something he said. This was dangerous territory. Elena was his employee, and he was still reeling from the disaster of his last relationship. But the connection between them felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. One evening, as they sat on his back terrace sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset over the city below, Alexander realized he was falling in love with his housekeeper. Not the desperate, rebound kind of love, but something steady and true and completely unexpected. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. After everything that had happened, after all the ways he'd already disrupted both their lives, was he really going to complicate things further by falling for the one person who'd seen him at his lowest and chosen to stay anyway? Elena seemed to sense the shift in his mood. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Alexander looked at her profile in the golden light of sunset and felt his heart make a decision his mind wasn't quite ready for. "I'm thinking that 3 weeks ago I thought I knew exactly what my life was supposed to look like," he said. "And now I have no idea what happens next." Elena turned to meet his eyes, and something passed between them that felt like recognition, like possibility, like the beginning of something entirely new. "Maybe not knowing is okay," she said quietly. "Maybe it's even better." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Alexander wanted to reach for Elena's hand, to tell her how she'd changed everything about the way he saw his life. But before he could find the words, his phone buzzed insistently on the table between them. The caller ID showed Marcus, his best man and business partner. Alexander had been avoiding most calls, but Marcus wouldn't call unless something was genuinely urgent. "I should take this," he said apologetically. Elena nodded and began collecting their empty wine glasses, giving him privacy for the conversation. "Marcus, what's going on?" "Alex, we have a problem. The Henderson deal is falling apart. They're saying your personal instability makes you a liability. The board is panicking, and there's talk of a vote of no confidence." Alexander felt ice water in his veins. The Henderson acquisition was the biggest deal of the year, one that would secure his company's position in emerging markets for the next decade. If it collapsed, it could trigger a cascade of other problems. "How bad is it?" he asked, watching Elena disappear into the house. "Bad. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Alex, you need to get ahead of this." The runaway groom story was manageable, but now there are questions about your judgment, your ability to lead. After hanging up, Alexander sat alone on the terrace as darkness settled around him. The peaceful evening he'd been sharing with Elena felt like a dream, interrupted by harsh reality. His choices had consequences beyond his personal life, and now the company he'd spent 15 years building was at risk. Elena returned with a cup of tea, setting it gently beside him. "Everything okay?" Alexander explained the situation, watching her face carefully for signs of judgment or disappointment. Instead, he saw only concern and something that looked like determination. "What do you need to do?" she asked simply. "Save my company, probably. Which means convincing a room full of investors that I'm still the same ruthlessly focused businessman they've always known." Elena was quiet for a moment, stirring her own tea thoughtfully. "Are you the same person?" "No," Alexander admitted. "I'm not. These past few weeks have changed everything about how I see myself and what I want." "Then maybe the question isn't how to convince them you haven't changed. Maybe it's how to show them that the changes make you a better leader." Her insight cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. He could try to return to his old ways, suppress the growth he'd experienced, and probably salvage the immediate crisis. Or he could trust that the person he was becoming was worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything he'd built. What if they don't see it that way? What if being more authentic means losing everything? Elena reached across and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. Then you'll build something new, something that fits who you really are. The next morning, Alexander stood outside the boardroom of his own company, wearing his most expensive suit but carrying himself differently than he had just a month ago. There was less performance in his posture, more genuine confidence. Elena had offered to drive him, but he'd insisted she didn't need to involve herself in his business crisis. She'd hugged him goodbye at the front door, whispering, "Remember who you are." The boardroom was tense when he entered. 12 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod from across the table. "Gentlemen, ladies," Alexander began, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I know you have concerns about recent events and what they mean for our company's future." Richard Steinberg, the board's most senior member, leaned forward. "Alexander, we've worked together for over a decade. What happened at that wedding was completely out of character. The Henderson Group is questioning your stability, and frankly, so are some of us." "Richard's right," added Sarah Chen, the board's newest member. "Our investors expect consistent leadership. Personal drama creates uncertainty in the market." Alexander had prepared for these objections, had rehearsed responses designed to minimize and deflect. Instead, he found himself saying something entirely different. "You're absolutely right that my behavior was out of character, because the character I'd been playing wasn't really me." The room went silent. This wasn't the damage control they'd expected. "For the past 15 years, I've made decisions based on what I thought a successful CEO should do. I've prioritized profit over people, growth over purpose, image over authenticity. And it worked, for a while. We built an incredibly profitable company." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where his business empire had taken root. But something was missing. We were successful, but we weren't making a meaningful difference. We were growing, but we weren't building anything that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. "Alexander," Richard interrupted, "what are you saying?" Quote, Alexander turned back to face the room. "I'm saying that walking away from that wedding was the first honest decision I'd made in years, and it's shown me that we can do better, not just as a company, but as people who happen to run a company." He moved to the presentation screen and pulled up financial data he'd prepared the night before. "Look at our employee satisfaction scores. They're mediocre. Our community impact initiatives are afterthoughts. Our innovation has stagnated because we're so focused on safe bets that we've forgotten how to take meaningful risks." Sarah frowned. "Our profits are at an all-time high. And our turnover rate is at 30% annually. We're making money, but we're not creating value. There's a difference." Alexander clicked to the next slide, showing a comprehensive plan he'd developed over the past week, with Elena's insights echoing in his mind. "I want to propose something different. Instead of just acquiring Henderson's distribution network, what if we partnered with them to revolutionize how technology serves underserved communities? Instead of just expanding our market share, what if we focused on expanding our positive impact?" The presentation continued for 45 minutes. Alexander outlined a vision for the company that prioritized sustainable growth, employee well-being, and social responsibility without sacrificing profitability. He showed projections demonstrating that companies with strong ethical foundations consistently outperformed their competitors in the long term. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "This is a significant departure from our current strategy," Richard said finally. "It is, and I understand if you're not comfortable with that level of change. But I believe this direction doesn't just make us more profitable in the long run, it makes us a company worth being proud of." Marcus spoke up. "What about Henderson? They're still concerned about the wedding situation." Alexander smiled. "Then let's show them who we really are, not through spin or damage control, but through our actions and our values. If they decide that's not the kind of partner they want, then maybe they're not the kind of partner we need." The discussion that followed was heated, but productive. Some board members were skeptical, others intrigued. By the end of the meeting, They'd agreed to give Alexander 6 months to prove that his new approach could deliver results. As the board members filed out, Marcus lingered behind. "That was either brilliant or career suicide," he said. "I'm not sure which." "Maybe both," Alexander replied. "But it felt right." Alexander left the office earlier than he had in years, eager to share the day's events with Elena. He found her in the garden behind his house, tending to the vegetable plot she'd started the week before. She wore old jeans and a sun hat, her hands dirty from the soil. "How did it go?" she asked, looking up from the tomato plants she'd been staking. "I told them the truth," he said, sitting on the garden bench beside her. "About everything. About how I've been pretending to be someone I'm not. About wanting to build something meaningful instead of just profitable." Elena set down her gardening tools and gave him her full attention. "And what did they say?" "They gave me 6 months to prove that authenticity is good business." "And if it's not?" Alexander considered this. A month ago, the possibility of losing his company would have sent him into a panic. Now, sitting in the garden with dirt under Elena's fingernails and the smell of growing things in the air, it felt manageable. "Then I'll start over. Build something new." Elena smiled, that radiant expression that had become his favorite sight in the world. "You're not the same person who ran from his wedding 4 weeks ago." "No, I'm not. Is that good or bad?" "It's real," she said. "And real is always better." That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had become the heart of his transformed home, Alexander realized he needed to address the elephant in the room. His feelings for Elena had grown stronger every day, but he'd been afraid to complicate their relationship given everything else in flux. "Elena," he said as she chopped vegetables for the stir-fry they were making, "can we talk about something?" She paused, perhaps hearing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course." Alexander turned down the heat under the pan where he'd been cooking rice and turned to face her fully. "These past few weeks, having you here, working together, talking about everything, it's been the best part of a very complicated time." Elena set down her knife, her expression careful but not closed off. "For me too," she said softly. "I know the situation is complicated. You're my employee, technically. I'm still dealing with the fallout from my last relationship, but Elena, what I feel for you, it's not gratitude or rebound or convenience." He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "It's real. You're the first person I've met who sees me. Not just the successful version of me, but all of me. The uncertain parts. The parts that want to build furniture instead of just financial empires." Elena's eyes searched his face. "Alexander, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm falling in love with you. And I know that's complicated and maybe unfair given everything you've already done for me, but I needed you to know." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Alexander felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Had he misread the connection between them? Had his feelings blinded him to her actual intentions? Then she stepped forward and placed her hand against his chest, right over his racing heart. "I fell in love with you weeks ago," she said. "The night you came home from the wedding, lost and honest and real for the first time since I'd known you. But I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want you to think I had ulterior motives." Relief flooded through Alexander like warm water. "Ulterior motives?" Elena smiled, but there was vulnerability in her expression. "You're a billionaire, Alexander. I'm your housekeeper. People would assume I was after your money." Alexander cupped her face in his hands, marveling at how perfect she felt. How right this moment was after weeks of careful distance. "Anyone who knows you would never think that. You're the most genuinely caring person I've ever met. You've seen me at my lowest and never tried to take advantage. If anything, you've pushed me to be better." "I love who you're becoming," Elena whispered. "The man in the workshop. The one who wants to build things that matter. The one who's brave enough to disappoint people who never really saw him anyway." Alexander recognized his grandmother's words from weeks ago, and his heart swelled with love for this woman who had somehow memorized the wisdom that mattered to her. "Elena Reyes," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you help me figure out what comes next?" "Always," she replied, just before he kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then deeper as weeks of careful restraint finally dissolved. When they parted, both were smiling through tears they hadn't realized they'd been holding back. "The rice is burning," Elena whispered against his lips. "Let it burn," Alexander replied, kissing her again. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the conference room where he'd once gambled his career on authenticity, facing the same board members who'd given him a chance to prove himself. The difference was that now Elena sat beside him not as his housekeeper, but as his partner in every sense of the word. "The numbers speak for themselves," Alexander said, clicking through slides that showed remarkable growth across every metric that mattered. Employee satisfaction is up 40%. Customer loyalty has increased by 35%. And yes, profits are up 22% over last year. Richard Steinberg leaned back in his chair, looking impressed despite himself. "The Henderson partnership has exceeded all projections. Because we approached it as a mission-driven collaboration rather than just an acquisition," Alexander replied. "When you lead with purpose, profit follows." Sarah Chen raised her hand. "What about the personal side?" "The media attention around your relationship has been significant." Alexander glanced at Elena, who squeezed his hand encouragingly under the table. "Elena and I are engaged," he said simply. "We're planning a small ceremony next month. Nothing like the spectacle I almost subjected myself to a year ago." The room chuckled, and Alexander realized how far he'd come from the man who'd once seen his personal life as a series of strategic decisions. "The point is," he continued, "when you stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be real, everything else falls into place. Our company is stronger, our partnerships are deeper, and yes, I'm happier than I've ever been." After the meeting, as the board members congratulated them both on their engagement and the company's success, Marcus pulled Alexander aside. "You know what the crazy part is?" Marcus said. "Running away from that wedding was the best business decision you ever made." Alexander laughed. "It wasn't a business decision at all. That's why it worked." That evening, Alexander and Elena returned to the house that had become their true home. The dining room table they'd finished together sat in the center of the main room, surrounded by chairs Alexander had built and Elena had upholstered. The space felt warm, lived in, real. "Are you happy?" Elena asked, echoing the question that had started his transformation months earlier. Alexander pulled her close, looking around at the life they'd built together from the ruins of his carefully constructed facade. "I'm happy," he said, and meant it completely. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside, the sun was setting over the city where Alexander Kane had once been known as the billionaire who ran from his own wedding. Now he was known as the CEO who'd revolutionized his industry by leading with heart instead of just ambition. But most importantly, he was known by Elena as the man who'd learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is disappoint the people who never really saw you anyway. In the kitchen where they'd first shared honest conversation, in the workshop where they'd built furniture and rebuilt dreams, in the garden where they'd planted seeds that had grown into something beautiful, Alexander had found what he'd been searching for without even knowing it. Not the perfect life he'd thought he wanted, but a real life worth living. A year and a half after the wedding that never was, Alexander and Elena exchanged vows in that same garden, surrounded by tomato plants and close friends. No media, no spectacle, no performance. Just two people who'd found each other in the aftermath of disaster and built something lasting from the pieces. As they danced to music played by a simple acoustic guitar, Alexander whispered in Elena's ear, "Thank you for staying that first night." "Thank you for running," she whispered back. And in that moment, Alexander understood that sometimes the best thing that can happen to your life is for it to completely fall apart, because that's when you finally have room to build something real. 3 years after their garden wedding, Alexander woke to the sound of Elena humming in the kitchen and the smell of her grandmother's coffee brewing. Their morning routine had become sacred to him. No phones, no urgent emails, just 20 minutes of connection before the day demanded their attention. He found her at the stove, wearing one of his old college t-shirts, and her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was making pancakes from scratch, something she did every Sunday without fail. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Sleep well?" "Always, when you're beside me." It was a simple exchange, but it grounded him in a way that million-dollar deals never had. This was what happiness looked like. Not the flash and glamour he'd once pursued, but quiet moments with the person who knew him completely. "I have something to tell you," Elena said, turning in his arms with an expression he couldn't quite read. Alexander's heart skipped. After 3 years together, he'd learned to recognize when Elena had news that would change everything. Good something or concerning something. Elena smiled, reaching into the pocket of her robe and pulling out a small white stick. Alexander stared at it for a moment before the 2 pink lines registered in his mind. "Elena," he breathed, "are you serious?" "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice full of wonder and joy. "We're going to have a baby." Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis. Not the panicked disorientation he'd experienced at his failed wedding, but a different kind of overwhelm, pure joy mixed with terrifying responsibility. He lifted Elena off her feet, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed. When he set her down, both of them had tears in their eyes. "Are you happy?" she asked, echoing the question that had become their touchstone. "I'm terrified," Alexander admitted, "and completely thrilled. I never thought I wanted children, but now I can't imagine anything better than raising a family with you." Elena placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby is going to be so loved." "Our baby is going to know exactly who their parents are," Alexander said. "No pretending, no performing. Just real people, trying their best." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, but it forced Alexander to confront aspects of himself he'd never examined. What kind of father would he be? His own father had died when Alexander was in college, leaving behind memories of a good man but no roadmap for parenting. Elena seemed to sense his uncertainty. One evening, as they assembled a crib in what would become the nursery, she looked up from the instruction manual. "You know what makes a good father?" she asked. "Tell me, because I honestly have no idea." "Being present. Showing up. Loving your child for who they are, not who you want them to be." Alexander paused in his installation of the crib's side rail. "What if I mess it up? What if I push them the way my father was pushed by his father? What if I create another person who spends decades trying to figure out who they really are?" Elena set down the manual and came to sit beside him on the nursery floor. "Alexander, you ran away from your own wedding because you couldn't bear the thought of living a lie anymore. Do you really think you're going to force our child to live one?" Her words settled something anxious in his chest. She was right. The man who'd had the courage to completely rebuild his life wasn't going to trap his child in false expectations. "Besides," Elena continued, "we're not raising this baby alone. They're going to have Marcus as an uncle, and my cousin Sophia, and all the people who love us for who we really are." As Elena's pregnancy advanced, Alexander found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The company that had once consumed his every waking moment began to feel like just one part of a much richer life. He started delegating more, trusting his team to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on long-term vision and strategy. The change didn't go unnoticed. "You're different," Marcus observed one afternoon as they reviewed quarterly reports. "More relaxed, but somehow more decisive, too." "Impending fatherhood will do that," Alexander replied. "When you know your time is about to become much more precious, you stop wasting it on things that don't matter." The board has noticed. Profits are up, employee satisfaction is at an all-time high, and you seem to have found some kind of secret formula for success. Alexander laughed. "The secret formula is caring about people more than spreadsheets. Turns out when you treat employees like human beings instead of resources, they do better work." "Revolutionary concept," Marcus said with a grin. "Who would have thought?" The conversation was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing with a text from Elena. "Baby's moving a lot today. I think they're practicing soccer." Alexander smiled, immediately distracted from profit margins and market projections. "I need to get home," he told Marcus. "Elena's having one of those days where the baby won't stop kicking." "Go," Marcus said. The quarterly reports will still be here tomorrow. 5 years earlier, Alexander would have stayed until midnight, convinced that his physical presence in the office was essential to success. Now he understood that being present for the moments that mattered was more valuable than any business achievement. He arrived home to find Elena on the couch, her hands resting on her rounded belly and a look of amused exasperation on her face. "Your child is using my ribs as a punching bag," she announced. Alexander sat beside her, placing his hands next to hers. Almost immediately, he felt a strong kick against his palm. "Hello, baby," he said softly. "Easy on your mom, okay? She's doing all the hard work here." As if in response, the kicking gentled to what felt more like gentle movements, like the baby was settling into a more comfortable position. "I swear this child already knows your voice," Elena marveled. "I hope so. I've been talking to them every night." It was true. Alexander had developed a habit of speaking to Elena's belly each evening, telling their unborn child about his day, sharing his hopes and fears, promising to be the kind of father who showed up for every important moment. "What do you tell them?" Elena asked. Alexander considered the question. "I tell them that they're already loved more than they can imagine. I tell them about the world they're coming into, about their mom's beautiful heart, about how we're going to build a life together based on truth instead of pretense." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "They're so lucky to have you as a father." "We're all lucky to have found each other," Alexander replied, kissing her forehead. When Elena went into labor on a rainy Thursday evening, Alexander felt the familiar sensation of his carefully ordered world shifting into something entirely new. But this time, instead of panic, he felt a deep sense of readiness. The labor was long and difficult. Elena was strong throughout, but Alexander could see the toll it was taking. He held her hand through contractions, brought her ice chips, and whispered encouragement when she was too tired to believe she could continue. "I can't do this," she gasped during a particularly intense contraction. "Yes, you can," Alexander said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. You rebuilt my entire life just by being yourself. You can absolutely do this." "We can do this," Elena corrected, squeezing his hand. "We can do this," he agreed. At 3:47 a.m., Isabella Marie Kane entered the world with a cry that seemed to announce her intention to make her presence known. When the doctor placed her in Elena's arms, Alexander felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "She's perfect," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. Alexander looked at his daughter, red-faced and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful, and felt something fundamental click into place. This tiny person would depend on him and Elena to show her what love looked like, what integrity meant, how to navigate a world that would try to convince her to be someone she wasn't. "Hello, Isabella," he said softly, touching her tiny hand with one finger. "I'm your dad. I've been waiting to meet you." The baby's cries quieted, and for a moment her dark eyes seemed to focus on his face. Alexander felt a responsibility, unlike anything he'd ever experienced in business or relationships. This wasn't about profit or success or image. This was about being worthy of the trust this small person was placing in him. "I promise you," he whispered, "I will always tell you the truth. I will always show up. I will love you for exactly who you are." Bringing Isabella home was like adding the final piece to a puzzle Alexander hadn't realized was incomplete. The house that had been transformed by Elena's presence now became a true family home. The nursery they'd prepared together filled with the sounds and smells of new life. Alexander approached fatherhood the same way he'd approached rebuilding his business after his transformation. With intention, presence, and a commitment to authenticity. He changed diapers at 3 a.m., learned to operate on 3 hours of sleep, and discovered that baby giggles were more rewarding than any standing ovation he'd ever received. "You're a natural," Elena observed one evening, watching Alexander give Isabella her bath in the small tub they'd set up in their bedroom. "I feel like I'm making it up as I go along," he admitted, carefully supporting Isabella's head while she splashed contentedly in the warm water. "We all are. That's what parenting is." Alexander looked at his daughter, who was staring up at him with the serious expression she wore when she was trying to figure something out. "What do you think, Isabella? Am I doing okay?" The baby responded by grabbing his finger and bringing it to her mouth, which Alexander chose to interpret as approval. As Isabella grew from a newborn into a curious, active baby, Alexander found that fatherhood was teaching him lessons no business school had covered. Patience when she refused to sleep through the night. Flexibility when she decided that the carefully planned feeding schedule meant nothing to her. Unconditional love when she was cranky and difficult and absolutely perfect all at the same time. But perhaps most importantly, fatherhood was teaching him about presence. In business meetings, his mind had often wandered to other deals, other opportunities. With Isabella, he discovered a kind of focused attention he'd never experienced before. When she was learning to sit up, nothing else in the world mattered but being there to catch her if she wobbled. When she said her first word, "Dada," Alexander felt more pride than he had at any business achievement. "I never understood before," he told Elena one evening as they watched Isabella play with wooden blocks on the living room floor. "Why?" People said, "Having children changes everything. I thought it just added responsibility. I didn't realize it would fundamentally alter how I see the world." "How so?" Alexander watched his daughter stack blocks with intense concentration, her little tongue poking out slightly as she focused. "Everything I do now, I think about how it will affect her. Not just financially, but the kind of world I'm helping create for her to grow up in. The example I'm setting, the values I'm demonstrating through my choices." Elena smiled. "You mean you can't just think about quarterly profits anymore?" "I think about what kind of company I want her to be proud of when she's old enough to understand what I do. I think about the employees whose children will grow up alongside her. I think about building something that makes the world better, not just more profitable." It was a transformation that extended beyond personal philosophy into practical business decisions. Alexander began prioritizing environmental sustainability, not because it was trendy, but because he wanted Isabella to inherit a healthy planet. He implemented more generous family leave policies, because he understood now how precious those early months with a child were. He invested in education initiatives, because he wanted all children to have opportunities to discover their authentic selves. The changes didn't go unnoticed by the business community. Kane's company has become the gold standard for ethical business practices, read an article in Forbes. Since becoming a father, CEO Alexander Kane has proven that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. But the recognition that mattered most to Alexander came from Isabella herself. When she was 8 months old, she started reaching for him the moment he walked through the door each evening. When she was 10 months old, she crawled across the room to where he sat working on his laptop, pulled herself up using his leg, and babbled what sounded remarkably like, "Work done?" "She's right," Alexander said to Elena, closing the laptop immediately. "Work is done. Family time now." It became their new rule. When Alexander came home, work stopped. No emails, no calls, no exceptions. The evening hours belonged to Elena and Isabella, and the life they'd built together. One evening, when Isabella was almost a year old, Alexander found Elena in the nursery, rocking their daughter to sleep and singing softly in Spanish. The scene was so perfect, so complete, that Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what he'd been searching for his entire adult life without knowing it. Not success as the world measured it, but success as his heart defined it. A home filled with love, work that mattered, relationships built on truth rather than convenience. "Thank you," he whispered to Elena when she emerged from the nursery. "For what?" "For seeing who I could become before I saw it myself. For staying that first night when I came home broken. For believing that running away from my wedding was the beginning of something better, not the end of everything good." Elena took his hands in hers, the same gesture she'd made that first evening when he'd confessed to running away from his own altar. "Thank you for having the courage to disappoint people who never really saw you anyway," she replied, using her grandmother's words that had become their private motto. "And for showing Isabella what it looks like when someone chooses to be real instead of perfect." As they stood together in the hallway outside their daughter's room, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 3 years ago, he'd been a man so focused on external validation that he'd almost married someone who didn't really know him. Tonight, he was a husband and father whose greatest achievement wasn't a business deal or a stock price, but the quiet trust of a baby who reached for him when she needed comfort. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old patterns of thinking had tried to reassert themselves. But with Elena's steady presence and now Isabella's innocent faith in him, Alexander had learned that authenticity wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. A choice to show up as himself, flaws and all. A choice to prioritize relationships over recognition. A choice to build a life that felt true from the inside out. Standing in the hallway of the home they'd created together, listening to their daughter's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that running away from his wedding had been the best decision he'd ever made. Because sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually needed. And sometimes the person who helps you put the pieces back together turns out to be the love of your life, disguised as someone you'd barely noticed before your world fell apart. In the kitchen where they'd first shared honest conversation, Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine, while Elena prepared a late dinner. Isabella was sleeping peacefully upstairs, and the house felt full of quiet contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, noticing his reflective mood. "Just how different everything is now. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be this happy, I wouldn't have believed them. And now?" Alexander pulled Elena close, dancing slowly to music only they could hear. "Now I know that happiness isn't something you achieve or acquire. It's something you choose, every single day, by being brave enough to be exactly who you are." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.